For most Americans, 1941 was a year of awakening. Factories roared to life, flags unfurled over small-town streets. Young men lined up to serve a country about to enter the greatest war the world had ever known. But not everyone who loved that flag was allowed to fight for it. In the segregated South, freedom had boundaries. In Alabama, a boy could watch planes trace silver lines across the sky. But if his skin was dark, that dream was chained to the ground. America called itself the land of the free, yet its own citizens were told they lacked the intelligence, the discipline, the courage to fly. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the nation cried for pilots, men who could defend the sky itself. Thousands of African Americans volunteered, but the War Department had already decided Negroes cannot fly in combat. They were offered shovels, not cockpits, uniforms, not wings. Yet in the town of Tuskegee, Alabama, a handful of men refused to believe that lie. They came from farms, from factories, from college classrooms. Some had never even seen an airplane up close, but they carried something stronger than steel. Faith. Faith that skill knows no color. Faith that courage speaks louder than hate. The government called it an experiment. The newspapers laughed. Even seasoned officers said it was a waste of fuel. But inside those hangars, history was taking shape. One heartbeat, one lesson, one broken barrier at a time. They trained in aging biplanes, patched together from spare parts. They sweated through Alabama heat, listened to jeers from white instructors, and still they climbed back into the cockpit. Every takeoff was defiance. Every landing, a small victory against centuries of doubt. They were the sons of sharecroppers and teachers, dreamers who looked at the sky and refused to bow their heads. While America fought for freedom across the ocean, these men fought for the right to prove they belonged in that same fight. The day they left the ground, the chains that held them were still there. Not of iron, but of prejudice, of doubt, of silence. Yet above the clouds, those chains began to break. For the first time, America's forgotten sons felt the air rushing past their wings. In a war built on hate, their greatest weapon would be dignity. Their mission had not yet begun, but their fight for respect had already taken flight. The government called it the Tuskegee Experiment. To the men who signed up, it was no experiment. It was a chance, perhaps their only one, to prove that skill and courage did not belong to a single race. Every day began the same: roll call at dawn, drills under the heat, and endless lessons in aerodynamics, navigation, and discipline. But the real test was not in the air. It was surviving the gaze of those who didn't want them there. White officers whispered that the experiment was doomed before it began. Some refused to teach. Others sabotaged the training. Aircraft were withheld, fuel was rationed. But the men of Tuskegee refused to quit. They repaired their own planes, studied late into the night, and flew every hour they could steal. Every mistake was a headline waiting to happen. Every crash, every stumble would be used as proof that they didn't belong in the sky. But every successful landing became a whisper of defiance. Every takeoff carved a scar into prejudice. They formed bonds stronger than steel. If one man stumbled, another lifted him. If one fell behind, the rest circled back. They weren't just learning to fly. They were learning to trust one another in a world that didn't trust them. Even within the walls of Tuskegee, there were sparks of change. A few officers saw the truth. These men were not an experiment. They were the future. Parrish would later say, "Give them a fair chance, and they'll give you history." The cadets faced more than flight exams. They faced letters from home. Fathers beaten for speaking too proudly of them. Mothers who worked 2 jobs just to buy them postage stamps. Each letter was a reminder of the world they were fighting for, and the one that still fought against them. Narrator: in the official reports, it was still the Tuskegee Experiment. But among the men who wore the leather jackets and red scarves, it was already something greater, a brotherhood born of fire, fueled by dignity. They would not be remembered as an experiment. They would be remembered as the ones who refused to fail. And soon, their wings would carry them beyond the fences of Tuskegee, into the heart of a war that would test not just their skill, but the very soul of the nation that doubted them. By early 1944, the men of Tuskegee had crossed the ocean. They had traded the red clay of Alabama for the dust of the Italian front. Their new home, Ramitelli Airfield, was little more than mud, canvas, and faith. But to them, it was sacred ground, the first battlefield where they could prove they were not an experiment, but warriors. The orders were simple and impossible. Escort bombers across hostile skies, protect every one of them, lose none. Because a single mistake would not just be a failure, it would be ammunition for every man back home who said they didn't belong here. The mission, to strike deep into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. The Germans called it Flak Alley. For the Red Tails, it would be remembered as the River of No Return. At 0600 hours, the first formation lifted off. The propellers sliced the morning air like clockwork. Every pilot carried two enemies into the sky, the Luftwaffe ahead, and the weight of expectation behind. Flak exploded around them, black smoke against blue heaven. One burst tore through the wing of Lieutenant Smith's Warhawk. He didn't panic, he steadied his flight, kept formation, and muttered into the radio, "Still with you, Red Leader." For the first time, bombers overhead saw something new, a fighter escort that refused to break, refused to run. High above the Apennine Mountains, the Tuskegee Airmen carved their legend with discipline, not fury. They stayed close to the bombers, even when German fighters tried to lure them away. The white bomber crews, skeptical at first, watched as these colored pilots guarded them through storms of steel. One pilot later wrote in his logbook, "When I saw those red tails below me, I knew I'd make it home." By the end of that day, the 332nd Fighter Group had done what few thought possible. No bombers lost. 0. Word spread faster than the planes themselves. The experiment had crossed the river of no return and come back victorious. That night, under the Italian stars, the men gathered around a single lantern, faces lit by its glow, the distant thunder of the front echoing beyond the hills. No speeches, no celebration, just the sound of men who had earned the right to be silent because the sky had already spoken for them. The next morning, official dispatches would call it a successful escort mission. But history would remember it differently. For on that day, the sons of Tuskegee proved that courage flies higher than prejudice. War had a way of stripping men down to their core. For the Tuskegee Airmen, that core was brotherhood. They had come from different states, different lives, teachers, mechanics, musicians, farmhands. But in the war, all those stories folded into one. Every man carried the same weight, proved not only his skill, but his worth. Between missions, they found comfort in ritual, checking each other's gear, sharing stories, laughing through fear. They knew that the next sunrise could take one of them away. And so every night, they clung to laughter like oxygen. Lieutenant Lucky Jefferson kept a harmonica tucked in his flight jacket. He said it reminded him of home, and it calmed his hands before takeoff. Captain Lucas would joke that it was their secret weapon. "Play that thing loud enough, Lucky. Maybe the Germans will surrender." But when he played, even the coldest night felt warmer. Each mission bonded them tighter. They flew not just as a unit, but as one heartbeat. In radio silence, they could read each other's moves, a roll, a dive, a climb, like notes in a familiar song. Then came the day the music stopped. Lieutenant Harris, one of the youngest, was hit by flak returning from a raid over Linz. His aircraft caught fire, but he stayed in formation, refusing to break the escort line. His last radio message was calm, almost steady. "Tell my mama I did my job." That night, no one spoke during dinner. The tent was quiet except for the rain drumming on canvas. Captain Lucas lifted Harris's chair, folded it, and leaned it against the wall. No words, just a space left open. Loss became their shadow, but instead of breaking them, it welded them together. Every mission after that carried his memory in the roar of their engines. They began painting tiny white stars beneath their cockpits, one for each comrade who didn't return. And soon, those red tails became more than a mark of identity. They were a promise that no bomber under their guard would fall if they could help it, that every pilot lost would be carried forward in the wings of the next. They had entered the war as a segregated unit, a separate experiment in a divided army. But by now, the sky made no such distinctions. Up there, courage had only one color. They weren't just fighting Nazis anymore. They were fighting to prove that unity, born of shared risk, pain, and loyalty, could fly higher than hate ever could. Spring 1944. The war in Europe burns at full fury. Every mission across the Mediterranean sky is a gamble. Each mile closer to Germany means another chance to never return. But for the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails, this was their moment to prove that skill, courage, and brotherhood could rewrite history itself. Their orders were simple: protect the bombers. No chasing enemy fighters, no glory, no deviation. Stay with the bombers until they reach home. A rule many other squadrons ignored, but not the Red Tails. They guarded the skies with discipline born of pain and pride. Where others saw limits, they saw responsibility. Every bomber that made it home was another victory against both the Luftwaffe and the prejudice waiting for them on the ground. They fought not for medals, but for respect. And slowly word spread among the bomber crews. The name Red Tails became a promise, a symbol that someone was watching your back. White bomber pilots, once skeptical, began requesting them by name. "If I see those red tails behind me," one man wrote home, "I know I'll make it back to England." 5 missions this week. The Germans hit hard, but our boys kept the bombers safe. Not one lost today. It's a record I'm proud to live by. By mid-1944, the 332nd Fighter Group had the lowest bomber loss rate in the entire 15th Air Force. Their success was impossible to deny, even for those who had tried to keep them grounded. The tide had turned, not just in the air, but in hearts. The Red Tails were no longer an experiment. They were heroes. Some never returned. But those who did carried something greater than medals. They carried proof that courage knows no color, and that loyalty can change the course of history. By summer of 1944, the Red Tails had become a legend, whispered across every bomber crew in Italy. They had guarded men they'd never met, white, black, southern, northern, and brought them home again and again. In the skies, there were no ranks of race, only brothers in the fight to survive. At first, they had been doubted, even mocked. Now they were greeted with cheers. Bomber crews left chocolate bars and handwritten notes for them on the airfields. "Thank you for keeping us alive. See you up there, Red Tails." In war, respect isn't given. It's earned, flight by flight, mission by mission. And in those moments between takeoff and landing, between fear and faith, a new kind of brotherhood was born, one forged not by color, but by courage. They shared the same skies, the same dangers. When a bomber went down, red-tail pilots marked the spot, calling in rescue coordinates, even when it meant drawing fire from German guns below. They refused to leave their comrades behind. The war had a way of stripping men down to their core. In the end, the color of your skin didn't matter when you were both staring at the same flak-filled sky. In those fleeting exchanges, a nod, a handshake, a shared silence, walls began to crack. Prejudice didn't vanish overnight, but it faltered, just for a moment, in the roar of engines and the courage of men who refused to hate back. They weren't fighting just for victory. They were fighting for recognition, for dignity, for the right to be remembered as equals beneath the same sky. By the winter of 1944, the Red Tails were no longer newcomers. They were veterans, confident, disciplined, and ready for the missions that tested even the most seasoned flyers. Their orders now were different. No longer short-range escorts over Italy. This time, they would fly deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. The target, German industrial cities, Regensburg, Munich, Vienna, where aircraft factories and fuel depots kept the Luftwaffe alive. The bombers had to reach them, and the Red Tails would make sure they did. Stay tight. Protect the heavies. Don't chase the enemy unless you must. The same command they'd heard 100 times, but today it would be tested like never before. As they crossed the Alps, the temperature inside the cockpits dropped below freezing. Frost clung to oxygen masks. Below them, white peaks and endless valleys. Ahead, Germany. They came fast and hard, WW-19s and Mi-19s diving from the clouds. For a moment, the sky erupted, streaks of tracer fire, smoke, the flash of cannon bursts. The Red Tails broke formation, not to chase, but to defend, weaving, rolling, holding the line. In the confusion, discipline became their weapon. They refused to be baited into dogfights. Instead, they stayed with the bombers, their red tails a promise of protection in the storm. When the bombers finally reached their targets, the sky above Germany burned. Factories crumbled, rail lines vanished in smoke. But even as the bombers turned home, the red tails stayed, circling, scanning the horizon, ready to face another wave. Hours later, when they landed back at Ramitelli Airfield, the ground crews counted bullet holes, dozens in each plane. But the bombers they escorted, everyone made it home. The mission to Regensburg would be remembered as one of the most dangerous of the war, and one of the most flawless. For the first time, Allied command realized something undeniable. No one, not even the elite white fighter groups, could match the Red Tails' record of perfect protection. Victory in the skies came at a price. For every bomber saved, there was a pilot who didn't return. The Red Tails were earning a reputation for perfection, but behind every perfect escort mission, there were names carved into silence. They had been taught to fight without fear, but nothing could prepare them for the sight of an empty bunk, a helmet hanging untouched, a letter returned unopened. Every mission carried the same ritual. Before takeoff, they shook hands, not for luck, but for memory. Each man knew the odds, and yet they smiled, pretending the sky would always give them back. They had proven their worth to a country that had once denied them a seat at its table. But recognition came too late for many. Letters home turned into telegrams, the kind that made mothers collapse on their porches and fathers stare at the horizon, wordless. Even the survivors carried the weight. Night after night, they wrote to families. He flew well. He was brave. They left out the part where they'd seen his plane spiral into smoke, or how long they waited for a parachute that never opened. In war, heroes are celebrated. But the truth, the quiet truth, is that courage always costs something. The Red Tails had paid in friends, in sleepless nights, in memories they could never erase. Still, they flew. Not because they loved war, but because they refused to let their fallen brothers be forgotten. Every takeoff became a promise. We fly so that your name will not fade. History would remember their victories, the medals, the missions, the headlines. But the Red Tails themselves remembered the faces, the laughter before takeoff, the quiet prayers before dawn, the way the airfield felt when one of their own didn't return. Glory made them legends, but sacrifice made them human. In May of 1945, the guns of Europe fell silent. The Red Tails had done what no one believed they could. Over 200 bomber missions. 0 losses to enemy fighters on their watch. They had guarded America's bombers, and in doing so, guarded America's honor. The men they once called an experiment were now called heroes. B-17 crews requested them by name. Give us the Red Tails. In the skies over Berlin, respect had finally found its voice. But when the war ended, and their planes touched down for the last time, another battle began. Not over Europe, but back home. They came home to parades they couldn't join, restaurants that wouldn't serve them, and job offers that vanished when they walked through the door. They had fought for freedom abroad and found its limits waiting on their own doorstep. Still, they stood tall. For every closed door, they carried themselves with the pride of those who had earned the right to fly and to be seen. Some became instructors, some became engineers. Others, men like Benjamin O. Davis Jr., would rise to reshape the very Air Force that once doubted them. Their legacy did not end when the war did. It took flight in every black pilot who followed, in every young dreamer who looked to the sky and saw no boundaries there. History would finally catch up to their courage. Decades later, presidents would pin medals to their chests, children would learn their names, and the world would understand what they had already known, that the measure of a man is not the color of his skin, but the height of his flight. The Red Tails proved that freedom is not given, it's earned. One flight, one mission, one sacrifice at a time. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories. The roar of engines fades. The faces in the photographs grow older, but the echoes of valor never truly disappear. For the men of the 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, their war was more than a battle for victory. It was a fight for recognition, for dignity, for the right to belong in the sky. In every mission, they rewrote what courage looked like. Not in the medals they earned, but in the quiet moments. The steady hand on the throttle, the whispered prayer before takeoff, the silent promise that no bomber under their guard would fall. History often remembers wars through maps and battles, but sometimes it's the men in the margins who change everything. Their legacy lives not only in museums or medals, but in every dream that dares to rise above doubt. Because courage doesn't fade with time. It echoes across generations, across the sky, across the hearts of those who still believe in the promise of freedom. They once flew for a nation that doubted them. Now, the nation flies because of them. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that the sky has no color, and that the measure of freedom is found not in who we are, but in how high we dare to fly. courage opened the skies for generations to come.